Hi guys, I'm just another guy named James, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite DC characters, Green Arrow. Now, Green Arrow is a character with a really long and sort of complex history, because he was originally created in 1941 by DC Comics, and he was created to imitate the success of Batman. And you can see this. He was a billionaire. He was a billionaire superhero with no superpowers, and he used gadgets and gizmos, only for Green Arrow that were attached to arrows, to fight crime with his teenage sidekick, who wore a bright, vibrant red and yellow costume. There's a lot of similarities between these two characters. And throughout the Golden Age of comics, and the Silver Age, which is 1936 to 1969, Green Arrow and Speedy just sort of adventured around. And during World War II, they fought with the DC superheroes team, the Seven Soldiers of Victory. But overall, they just kind of stagnated and had adventures of their own. Green Arrow also joined the Justice League of America eventually, but Green Arrow never had his own comic. He was a regular feature in World's Finest and Adventure Comics, which were two sort of anthology series, I guess you would say, where they were a bunch of different characters all appearing in the same title because they didn't have a comic book of their own. So, the Silver Age boom, marked by Marvel emerging onto the scene, sort of passed Green Arrow by. But that all changed beginning in the Bronze Age, which starts in 1970, when Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams began their run with the character. Now, during this time, the Green Arrow was appearing every month in Green Lantern. And this is one of the most famous comic runs of all time, Green Lantern and Green Arrow. But part of the Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil reboot was making Green Arrow. They changed his costume, they changed his whole look, they gave him the goatee. So they changed his look, but they also changed his personality. He wasn't just the campy crime fighter with the bow and arrow anymore. He was a fighter against social injustice, and he was no longer rich. He had been swindled out of his fortune. So, and one more thing, he was also like an extremely political person, and he was a very liberal superhero, which made him counterpose to Green Lantern, who's typically portrayed as more conservative than Green Arrow. So it made for a lot of very interesting dynamics. But yeah, and the run lasted from 1970 to 1979. But eventually the characters had to go their separate ways. And Green Arrow began being a backup story in the Batman title Detective Comics. And this began in 1980. But by 1986, Green Arrow left the title. And after Crisis on Infinite Earths, Green Arrow was pretty much MIA. He was missing in action. Until, he was in a couple of the massive crossovers, but who cares about those? But eventually, Mike Grell began his run with the character with the Longbow Hunters. And that series was so successful that it ended up launching Green Arrow's success massively. So by 1988, Green Arrow got his first monthly series. And Mike Grell wrote this series for 80 issues, which is a very impressive run. But during the Grell run of Green Arrow was essentially cut off from the entire DC universe. And he again got a costume change, and he would also kill without remorse, which is like, what the heck? He's a superhero, that's not what he does. And furthermore, he was just kind of a entirely different character, and he abandoned his hometown of Star City, which he had sworn to protect, and he left it for Seattle, where he went to be with his longtime girlfriend, Black Canary. But that is not the story for today. The story for today is the 1994 Green Arrow Crossroads story, which is Kevin Dooley and Jim Aparo bringing Green Arrow back into the DC universe with a 9-10-part story. And the first issue starts with two supervillains fighting over a woman, while Green Arrow stops a graffitier and thinks about how he and Black Canary broke up, and he's pretty bummed out about that. But Oliver ends up being brought into the supervillain conflict, and he ends it by making all parties involved more mad at him than they were at each other, and he also decides to leave Seattle. And Oliver is Green Arrow's real name, but he first decides to stop by an old friend's house, and he finds out that his friend's husband is beating her. So when the husband comes home, him and Oliver have a fight/confrontation, which I'm actually going to read verbatim because I really like this. And they're having this confrontation in the woman's backyard. So yeah. So it starts off with Green Arrow trying to shoot this guy, and to which the husband responds, "You are of the bow. And you're of SOBs that beat their wives. I don't know how you did what you did, but it won't happen again. What were you trying to do? Pin my clothing to the wall? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not at all." In his thoughts. Now this I really don't need. Not at all. To defeat a true opponent, you must aim for the hearts, and the heart alone. Nice tricks, Nathan. Sorry, rival. Ever show them to your kids while beating them? I never hit my kids. Oh, Master Yoshimoto, an eternity since I held a bow, an eternity of emptiness. This is not your bow. What? Yes, it is. This bow means nothing to you. It is simply a tool. I could not kill a man with a bow that is not his. You are not of the bow. So yeah, that's the confrontation, and that last little bit is irrelevant to most of the rest of the story. But as Oliver gets a new bow because Rival broke his last one, it is revealed that Rival is a Yakuza, Japanese mafia. And after Oliver gets his new bow, he and Rival have a final fight, and Oliver ends up shooting him in the arm, and the couple gets back together. But just as the story seems like it's gonna have a nice ending, the wife shoots Rival because Rival was about to beat the kids, and Oliver goes to LA to investigate the Yakuza. And when Oliver arrives in LA, he has to take on some Yakuza ninjas immediately. But he's able to take care of them pretty easily, honestly. And then Green Arrow gets a call from an old model friend, so he goes to see her. But she is fat and ugly. And she also has gunmen going after her, and she dies when a helicopter attacks. Oliver is able to take out about half of the people in the helicopter, but he's running away, and the Huntress almost runs him over, and she takes care of the last two gunmen with her crossbow. But the chopper is able to get away, and the heroes follow it, leading to a fight in a factory, which Green Arrow and Huntress win really easily. And they go to the house of the one behind the plot and discover that she had people killed to protect her branded weight loss plan. So she gets arrested and Green Arrow goes to Vegas. But on his flight, Oliver has to stop some terrorists. But he ends up getting his eye injured, so on the ground he gets a fancy new eye patch. And Green Arrow is able to win some money in a slot machine, and he sits down for dinner, where he's attacked by 4 men for an unknown reason. He's able to fight them off, but when he tries to use his bow, he almost kills an innocent waitress because he's missing an eye, so his depth perception is really, really far off. So he takes a gun and he tries to check the hotel because he can line that up with one eye. So Oliver tries to check into a hotel, but the receptionist says he already checked into his room, which is odd since Oliver hadn't. So Oliver goes up to a room and finds that it's filled with munitions, with guns and rocket launchers and all sorts of stuff, and people outside of his room begin shooting at him. But when the bad guys go up into the room, Green Arrow takes some of them on, but a mystery man is taking on the others. The mystery man, who is also the true target of all the attacks Green Arrow's had to endure, is none other than Deathstroke, the Terminator. So Green Arrow and Deathstroke are able to fight their way out of the hotel by jumping into the pool from the blown out wall. Oliver and Deathstroke also steal a bus and make a run for it, and they're able to get away from the gangsters. And the gangsters work for Ben Savanga, Deathstroke's latest target. But the stolen bus is also full of passengers, so the heroes ditch it and buy some motorbikes. And they go to an airfield where they pay a helicopter pilot to take them to Savanga's casino, where they kill his henchman before Deathstroke finishes the job by killing the boss. Deathstroke pays Oliver for his trouble, and Oliver puts it on the roulette table before Deathstroke cuts off Oliver's goatee with a knife. And Oliver's ready to throw hands and fight Deathstroke about this, but he ends up winning a bunch of money, so he buys a car and he drives off to Dallas. In Dallas, Oliver has his first normal night, and he's able to stay in a hotel and everything, nothing goes wrong. But the next morning, things quickly go wrong, when Oliver goes to a museum to kill some time, but one of the curators is cornered by 3 guys looking to rough him up. So Oliver jumps in to defend him, and after a short fight, Oliver has them beat. So he has the curator explain why the enforcers were after him, and the curator does, saying that he had proof that an antique store had stolen Incan artifacts from the Peruvian government. So Green Arrow does some investigating of his own, and he starts spying on the store. But Catwoman shows up, so he thinks, oh, she must have stolen the Incan artifacts because she's a thief. But she didn't, and is actually working for the Peruvian government to recover the artifacts. So they team up to get back the artifacts, and as they crack the safe, the curator from earlier reveals that he is part of the plot to steal the artifacts. So Green Arrow and Catwoman fight their way out, recover the artifacts, and go their separate ways, leading Green Arrow to go to New Orleans to try and find himself again. So Oliver immediately gets in trouble this time, as he tries to defend a young girl on a riverboat, and he ends up chasing her on shore because she's the spitting image of Black Canary, so he wants to talk to her. He is then knocked out by a street vendor, and Green Arrow wakes up in the girl's house where her mother has some very strong words for him about how he's not really a hero and how he's this and this and this and this. But the girl says she's only 15 and has been working as a prostitute for years. So this makes Oliver incredibly mad, and he wants to go after the pimp. But the girl begs him not to. But that night, Oliver is taken to the swamp by the pimp, who is actually the girl's father. And if you thought he was angry before, man, now he's just on another level. And Oliver is able to free himself from the tree that he was tied to by just like snapping all the ropes. And he makes a handmade bow and a set of arrows, and he goes after the pimp. And he busts in on the pimp in the middle of trying to have sex with his own daughter. So Oliver makes the girl leave, and he deals with the pimp by shooting him in the heart with an arrow. Because, tell you what, if anyone in this story deserves an arrow through his chest, it's that guy. And then he leaves for New York. So Green Arrow spends most of his time in New York feeling useless and feeling sorry for himself, watching the current Justice League stop some major crimes. Eventually, Oliver ends up on the street with some bums, but the cops come to shake them down. But Oliver tries to fight back, but he ends up getting the alley and all of the bums' possessions lit on fire and torched. So Oliver, feeling even more sorry for himself, goes to Gotham. So Green Arrow starts off strong in this next story, wrought by stopping some people from stealing from a gun shop. But he is then kidnapped by the Batman villain Anarchy, who is attempting to destroy the Gotham gun factory. So Green Arrow storms off, and because he doesn't want to be part of a terrorist organization, and Anarchy's men plant bombs all over the factory and clear it of the workers so they can destroy it. But the circuit is messed up, and Green Arrow comes back and says that he will ignite the bombs by himself. And he does this by standing on the van, shooting arrows at the cops. And remember, these are the cops in Gotham City, where the police force at the time is not corrupt, because you got Jim Gordon as commissioner. So you've got the police that Oliver is fighting, and he ends up lobbing a flaming arrow into the factory to blow it up. And in the afternote of the story, Oliver says that he likes this town. So that's where the story sort of ends. There's another issue bearing the Crossroads name, but it's really just part of the 0 Hour crossover event, which I will talk about at some point, but for now it's not important because there are other things that you need to know before you can fully understand 0 Hour. But anyway, so talking about this story, overall, I do think it's good. The first two issues written by Kevin Dooley, these two, I do think they're good. They have their problems, but Kevin Dooley as a writer understands classic Green Arrow more, at least, than Mike Grell. So that's a bonus. I do not like Mike Grell's run of Green Arrow. And this story feels like it's running a lot of damage control from that story. But so after those first two issues, Kevin Dooley ends up having to take a four-issue break from writing the story, and that's these 4 issues. So the issue with Huntress, which is good but not great. The issues with Deathstroke, they're written by Alan Grant, and they are the standout of the story. These are the ones that I would just recommend as good comic books. You have this one, the one with Catwoman, which is written by Doug Monek, who I believe wrote Nightfall, or at least part of Nightfall. And then the last 3 issues were all written by Kevin Dooley. So in general, the highlight of this story is absolutely Jim Apparo's artwork, because it's really good. You've hopefully seen a good amount of it, but he only did one cover for this series, and that's this one. and that's the cover for issue 81, which hopefully I just showed on screen and not just held it up to my camera. But yeah, so Apparo's art is definitely the highlight, but I think the best, like I said, I think the best comic book stories are those 2 issues with Deathstroke. I think the best Green Arrow issue is the one where he's in New Orleans and fighting the pimp, prostitute, sex offender guy. I think that is the best Green Arrow story because he's fighting in small American town against social injustice. It's a very Adams O'Neill type of story. I think, but I do. So one thing that I will say about this story, the last 2 issues are far and away the weakest. 88, this issue with the Justice League is mostly fine. For most of the story, it's okay. When Oliver's like running around feeling useless. When he starts hanging out with the bums, that's when that's when the story loses me personally. But and that one's sort of just a whatever issue. You could take it or leave it. 89 is the last issue of the story. Is the one that personally I just do not like. I think it's a bad story. It's a bad Green Arrow story. It's out of character for Oliver to do what he does in that last issue. And overall, I don't like it. It's also, coincidentally, the only issue not drawn by one Mr. Jim Aparo, which really hurts it since it's a story set in Gotham City. And Aparo, you may know, because he was a longtime artist on all of the Batman titles. He worked on Brave and the Bold, Detective Comics, and just Batman. So it's a shame that he didn't do the one issue set in Gotham City, and I do wonder if the issue would have been different if he had any hand in the creation. But anyway, so that's Green Arrow Crossroads. Overall, it's a good story, and it does what it really needed to do, which is bringing Green Arrow back into the DC universe after 6 years of absence, and it's good for that. But overall, I would recommend plenty of other comic stories over it. But overall, if you can find it for like $1 a piece, I would recommend. So one thing I forgot to mention is actually that that in general media, the version of Green Arrow most similar to what you get in this comic story is in the TV show Arrow, especially the later handful of seasons, where Arrow will kill, but he won't just kill everybody. So yeah, so if you're looking for a good version of Green Arrow that's very similar to this comic story, I would recommend the 2012, I think that's right, CW show Arrow. Alright, I'm just another guy named James, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.